2 years ago, I uploaded the intro video for this second look segment, and truth be told, I was scared because I had no idea what the response would be. But within 12 hours of posting that video, I was blessed with 2 comments, both of which reassured me that doing this was actually a good idea. Admittedly, the ambition to post once a month did not last, but that's in light of realizing about 4 videos in that, while well-intentioned, that schedule was not realistic given all that I'm doing. In the long run, I am not fazed by this, because when I thought about it, I am more than okay with spending more time on this to finish what I began. Second Look is a journey within a journey. YouTube is a part of my life journey, and when you are pursuing your best effort, you'll learn that you don't have to do everything right this second. And that brings me to this video. I began writing it in 2014. It has gone through rewrite after rewrite while I was in various moods. I wanted to release it last year, but my heart told me to wait and do some more rewriting, and I always listen to my heart. It leads me right. Having said that, I am giving Man of Steel a second look because I believe it's a misunderstood and underappreciated film, and with Dawn of Justice now in theaters, it is the perfect time to share the value of this film. If you have the time, please have a listen. Whatever TV show you're binge watching can wait. Man of Steel. It is an unpopular opinion, but it is how I truly feel. I love this film. The story follows Kal-El as he is born on Krypton. The planet is dying, and General Zod is trying to take over. Fearing the outcome, Jor-El does what he thinks is best by securing the Krypton Codex within Kal, then sending him away to Earth. Zod, furious, kills Jor-El. He then vows to find Kal, before being sent into the Phantom Zone with his henchmen. But once Krypton is destroyed, the Phantom Zone releases them. On Earth, Kal lives his life not knowing who he is. Growing up isn't easy, but he gains powers over time, making him very strong. As a grown-up, he goes from one job to the next, never staying for too long out of fear of being discovered for what he is. Eventually, he encounters a reporter, Lois Lane. Exposure to his powers prompts her to write and publish a story. Like clockwork, General Zod then shows up looking for Kal and threatens the destruction of Earth and all of its inhabitants unless Kal surrenders. Kal obliges. But after Zod reveals his plans to make Earth the new Krypton, Kal chooses to defend Earth. The two duke it out, leading to the dramatic death of General Zod. Metropolis lays in ruin, but Kal has no plans to split. He adopts a simple disguise and goes to work at the Daily Planet, alongside
Lois Lane. Welcome to the planet.
Glad to be here, Lois.
To begin with, I have never been as big a fan of the Man of Steel character as I am a Spider-Man and, of course, Batman fan. I did dress up like him for Halloween twice, but even then I've never had a strong emotional connection to the character. Save for The Dark Knight Returns, I have not read any comic book or graphic novel with the Man of Steel featured, and I've also invested no time in any of the TV shows. I did, however, go through a brief stage of Man of Steel obsession when my dad bought me the Ultimate 14-disc Collector's Edition. 906 minutes of content overall. Watching all that shaped my perspective of the Man of Steel. I saw him as a humble hero who had a wealth of encounters with Lex Luthor, and always proved, no matter what the challenge, he could save the day. He never went through much of a character arc save for the second film where he chooses to be human and then goes back to being the Man of Steel, but he was always a reliable hero. Cue Man of Steel, which with Zack Snyder directing, David S. Goyer writing, and Christopher Nolan serving as executive producer, would lay the groundwork for a significant and dramatic character arc. My first time watching this movie was in the Metreon 16 IMAX theater in San Francisco. It is the same theater I saw Superman Returns in. And thinking back on that film compared to this one, Man of Steel for sure left a longer lasting impression on me. And I think, based on what's been produced opinion piece-wise online and everywhere else about Man of Steel since its release, it left a long lasting impression on a lot of people. The unfortunate part is that not a lot of those people liked what was done with the character. So let's examine. The reality is, the Man of Steel character has always been a really hard character to portray in film. He possesses such great strength and has so few weaknesses that finding a conflict that will genuinely challenge him can plague any writer with stress, even the best writers with stress. And to remind ourselves of where that stress took our character, let's go back in time for just a few minutes. In the first Christopher Reeve film, Mario Puzo, David and Leslie Newman, and Robert Benton had him face off with real estate lover Lex Luthor. The villain used kryptonite to prevent the Man of Steel from stopping 2 nuclear missiles. But of course, the Man of Steel prevailed. He saved the day and brought Lex Luthor back to jail with his pal Otis. Happy trails. With the second film, the same writers, minus Benton, put the Man of Steel against General Zod, Ursa, and Non. All 3 were confined to the Phantom Zone in the first film, and now, years later, in this film, they are released. Zod and co. go to the White House and force the president to kneel before Zod. When the president begs for the Man of Steel to save the day, Zod demands that he come and kneel before him as well. Things don't go quite as planned, and Zod and the Man of Steel end up in a pretty silly blockbuster fight. In the midst of it, Zod realizes the Man of Steel cares for humans and threatens bystanders. To prevent further harm, the Man of Steel flees to his fortress. It is there he defeats Zod, and peace is once again restored. Written by David and Leslie Newman, the third film goes into Bizarro territory and pits the Man of Steel against himself. It's hard to watch, especially when it's not done well, but the basic idea of a bad Man of Steel is an idea that we'll come back to because it's not an unrealistic idea. With film number 4, A Quest for Peace, written by Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal, we are given a clash between the Man of Steel and Nuclear Man, a Lex Luthor creation. He has the same powers as the Man of Steel, and during their first encounter, takes away his powers. After using a green crystal to get his powers back, the Man of Steel defeats Nuclear Man by creating a solar eclipse. The execution isn't very good, but regardless, Nuclear Man does boast a serious threat for the Man of Steel, and he must use his intelligence to save the day, and when he does, he saves the day yet again. Jumping forward years later to Superman Returns, we are working with writers Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris. They were given the task of writing the first Man of Steel film post 9/11. The result is a film that walks on eggshells and avoids major monuments for action scenes. The ones we're given are visually engaging, but the true focus of the movie is the relationship between Lois and the Man of Steel, and whether or not the world needs the hero. It's a question with a lot of fire behind it. Given the good the character can do, it makes you wonder what has inspired hope in his absence. One might say the idea that he would return, and that makes sense, because the only other possible inspiration isn't known to Metropolis. I am referring to Lois's son, the son of the Man of Steel. But even in that case, there's really no guarantee of where that character would end up. The interesting thing is the film takes a pretty neutral stance on the need for a hero. It does acknowledge the Man of Steel can still wow people, but for me the film lacked a lasting urgency. Whenever a superhero movie ends, I want to feel as though there is a lot more story to tell. When Returns ended, it felt like the last of the story had been told. That brings us to 2010, when in the process of writing the story for The Dark Knight Rises, David S. Goyer went to Nolan with a new idea for an origin interpretation of the Man of Steel. Nolan liked the idea, called Warner Brothers, and said, "We are making this movie, and I want to produce it." What the exact dialogue between them was, I have no idea, but I can imagine that Warner Brothers liked the idea because Goyer was staying true to his Batman philosophy. Pretend as if it's real. Nothing will be done just because it's cool or because it goes by the comics. It's a very different approach compared to the first film, but let's not forget that Donner and Co. had a different goal. Bring the character off the page and put him on the movie screen. And to accomplish that, you don't have to pretend any of it is real. And it worked just fine. The first theatrical effort was cheesy, sure, but it's also very magical and inspirational, and proved the character did not just belong in the comics. And for everyone who saw it, they really believed, a man could fly. Looking back, it's really hard to compare the first film to Man of Steel, given the time and circumstances. But the one comparison I do want to make, because it is important to me, is when Clark Kent becomes the Man of Steel. In the first film, it's well before the end. In Man of Steel, it's at the very end. Initially, it might come off as an odd choice, but it fits the realistic structure of Batman Begins, and staying true to that Batman philosophy enabled Goyer to make a bold and risky move, giving us a Man of Steel in training, someone who is very cocky and is going to make mistakes. And I think, given how we have always seen the character portrayed as a goody two-shoes, that seeing him in this movie making a mess and not saving everyone was a portrayal that was offensive to diehard fans. I can certainly understand that, but that's actually one of the choices I loved. Goyer gave us a human Man of Steel, someone who we can get mad at and question his intentions. Beforehand, we never did. He was just the hero who came when the time was right. You know, the bad guys were there. He came and put an end to all of it. But in Man of Steel, for the first time, the filmmakers challenged us and asked us to accept a Man of Steel who, when pushed, will kill. And during his BAFTA interview, Goyer had a thoughtful bit about that.
You can't rely on a crutch or a rule that exists outside of the narrative of the film. And so the situation was, Zod has said, I'm not going to stop until you kill me or I kill you. And the reality is, no prison on the planet could hold him.
Speaking as a fan of David S. Goyer, I agree. What must be understood about the choice to have the Man of Steel kill Zod is that Goyer did not make that choice with the intent of making the Man of Steel into a killer. He wrote that scene with the intent of morally testing the Man of Steel like never before. Zod's mindset is unflinching, and the Man of Steel knows the only way to stop him at all costs is to kill him. And Zod has a line that mirrors this exactly.
And every action I take, no matter how violent or how cruel, is for the greater good of my people.
The crazy thing is, when you think about it, the Man of Steel is the Zod for Earth, and while Kal is far more compassionate than Zod ever will be, he will fight for Earth just as hard as Zod will fight for Krypton. They both share a very strong and emotional duty to their planet. They were born to protect their people, no matter what the cost. And even after the Man of Steel snaps Zod's neck, it doesn't satisfy him. It destroys him. Zod may be the douchebag of all douchebags, but he was the only physical person left from Krypton. And when he dies, that means that Kal, to the best of his knowledge, is now the only person left from his home planet. And emotionally, that's pretty big. And with that in mind, let's go to the beginning of the film and talk about Krypton. Compared to the first film, the planet is largely CG. But the effects aside, the conflict between Zod and Jor-El is even greater. Zod kills Jor-El in his attempt to save Krypton. when his last chance is sent to Earth, it motivates him to hunt Cal down.
I will find him!
While he hunts him off screen, Cal is raised as Clark Kent by Martha and Jonathan Kent. And it's Jonathan who impresses upon Clark how important it is to keep his powers a secret.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
He is of the opinion that even if someone's life is at risk, Clark should not save them, even if it's Jonathan himself. The scene where Jonathan does not allow Clark to save him upset many fans. That's very understandable, but the choice is consistent with his belief that the world isn't ready for what Clark can do. I also have my own personal fanboy theory that says that, given how the tornado was pretty damn close to where Jonathan was, that Jonathan was terrified by the idea that in his rescue attempt Clark would die, because we actually don't know at that point in the story how fast Clark is. We do know he can't fly though, because we don't see that until this scene. It's a really cool scene too, because we get to watch Clark learn how to fly. Returns did show Clark as a boy doing some very intense jumping, but Man of Steel is where we get to really see Clark take first flight as an amateur. The flying effect worked pretty well for Donner and Reeve, but thanks to computers and the 1,500 people in visual effects, Henry Cavill flies fast and with style. And speaking of style, the effects and sound design are what help bring the film's vision to the level of extraordinary. Married together, they tell a story of destruction via power abuse. Zod's godlike presence triggers Clark to unleash his powers for the first time. It's a fight leaps and bounds better than what's been done before. Especially in Returns, where there was basically no fighting. In this movie, there is fist fighting and gunfighting, courtesy of the military. And you know, I really like how involved they are. They have an appropriately significant presence in the movie, and aren't just a backup plan. One of my favorite moments actually involves Colonel Nathan Hardy and Feora. He is shooting at her with a gun, and her shield is easily deflecting it. Then, when he runs out of bullets, without thinking twice, he then takes out a knife and gives her this look that says, "I dare you to stop me." Not only is that one of the most badass moments in this movie that made me just feel so awesome inside, but that's actually a mentality shared by many people in this movie. With Zod and saving Krypton, with Jor-El and sending Cal away, with Lois Lane tracking down and exposing Clark Kent, and with the Man of Steel and saving Earth. Everyone in this movie has something they are fighting for. Everyone has a want. The characters themselves have also notably progressed since the early films. Lois, for example, as played by Margot Kidder, was a single woman who was a hopeless romantic. As played by Kate Bosworth, she was a mom and had a new man in her life, the son of Perry White. She also had repressed feelings for the Man of Steel. As played by Amy Adams, she is an independent woman and has a very attractive confidence. When looking at the inclusion of Jor-El, it's interesting how, save for the beginning of the first movie, he is only ever seen in video messages, and this includes in Returns. In Man of Steel, we get Jor-El in the spirit form, and for me, that was more emotionally grabbing than seeing him in a video that was triggered by a crystal acting as a remote control. All that does is trigger boring exposition. But in Man of Steel, Jor-El is an active character and physically guides us through environments. He's basically the coolest tour guide ever, and his presence means a lot to me as a viewer. To me, it shows the filmmakers want us to be as engaged in the story as possible, and I appreciate that. I also love the emotionally striking relationship difference between Kal-El and General Zod. In the 1980 sequel, General Zod and his crew are released from the Phantom Zone via hydrogen bomb that was released into space by the Man of Steel. As mentioned before, he goes to the White House and makes the president kneel before him. It is only then that he learns of the existence of the Man of Steel, and that prompts him to demand the Man of Steel come before him and kneel. It's a polar opposite dynamic compared to this film, because in that film, General Zod has no idea up until that point that the Man of Steel exists, and he also has no desire to, rebuild Krypton. He wants to be the ruler of the Earth he has entered. In Man of Steel, Zod travels to Earth specifically for Kal, and once found, tries to get him on board with making Earth the new Krypton. The actions of the 1980 Zod prompt a silly good guy bad guy fight. In Man of Steel, the actions of Zod prompt a dramatic fight to the death. A lot of people argue the fight is ridiculous and drags on for too long, but I think it's spot on. It allows us to see what Kal can do as an amateur in both a small town and big city setting with his powers. Sure, it's easy to get mad at him for not saving all the people, but that's going to be a part of his growth. It's a necessary evil for the character to, in the next film, understand what it means to be the ideal hero, one that people can root for. If you make that easy, it's not earned. It has to be a reward given to him by the people. Let's now bring back the idea of a Bizarro Man of Steel. In Man of Steel, the character is not literally Bizarro, but his actions in the third act do reflect a Bizarro demeanor. He is rather cavalier about all the destruction. To me, it feels like the filmmakers employed a Bizarro demeanor to demonstrate how that shadow of the character lends itself to a more realistic approach compared to a Man of Steel who does everything right all the time. Because realistically, every hero has a moment where they question what's right, what's wrong, and to understand the difference, you put them in a physical scenario where they choose poorly and learn the hard way. Organic growth is a bitch. Let's now shift gears and go filmmaker on this movie. One element I cannot praise enough because it is so emotional and just right is the score by Hans Zimmer. Just like with the Dark Knight trilogy, his music brings the viewer into the world of the story. Honestly, I've lost track of how many times I have listened to his theme. It's just so good. And just like with whenever I listen to the John Williams score that was done way back when, I think to myself, yeah, that is Superman. Funny enough though, I think that's the opposite of what people thought in regard to this film's cinematography. Man of Steel was not shot like a traditional Hollywood movie. Amir Mokri shot most of the scenes handheld. Personally, I thought it was attractive. We've pretty much gotten past the shaky cam plague. And thankfully, this movie is one among few blockbusters with quality coverage. Unfortunately, I think, given how a lot of people are in general so used to the walk and talk dolly shots, and especially considering how Returns was shot with a very strict Hollywood storyboard-like mentality, that seeing Man of Steel and its documentary style offended quite a few fans. I was the exact opposite, and thanks to David Brenner, the editing is on point and digestible. Every cut has punch, and when the camera is doing its job, no cuts are forced. One of the finest examples of this is when Kal asks,
Where do I come from? Why did you send me here?
The camera then goes into a gorgeous rotation, showing an epic display of images that, accompanied by Jor-El's dialogue, tells the story of Krypton. It's pulled off in one shot and in less than 3 minutes. On the topic of time, Man of Steel runs 2.5 hours long, and its pacing never ceases to blow me away. Finding the right tempo for an action film is really difficult. It's not like a comedy where you have to have laughs in every scene. In an action film, you don't have to have a car chase, a gunfight, a fist fight in every scene. But in every scene, without one of those, you do have to convince the audience of why the next one is valid and required to move the story forward. In this movie, every scene has a purpose, and whenever I watch it, I find it really easy to escape into the world. And storytellers who can provide that kind of experience have a gift. The interesting thing is that before this movie, the only Zack Snyder film I've ever really enthusiastically rewatched is Watchmen. And in retrospect, that movie was perfect training for this movie. Both are visually ambitious. The heroes are not all, at least initially, likable, and we are asked to invest in a character who has godlike abilities and can never fully unleash his powers because it's too dangerous. It all goes back to what Uncle Ben said in Spider-Man.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Sure, that wasn't Spider-Man, but guess what? It applies here too. The Man of Steel will learn that responsibility through what he has exposed the people to. He'll learn that donning that suit doesn't guarantee humans will accept him, and that's a big part of the real-world factor. The suit implies an ideal he'll have to showcase. This is brought to the forefront of attention during the interrogation scene, when Clark and Lois talk about the S.
What's the S stand for?
It's not an S. On my world, it means hope.
Well, here it's an S.
Lois doesn't explicitly say this, but it's in the subtext. Her line says that humans take things at face value, and that's exactly what filmgoers did with this movie. People saw an S, but no one saw hope. They saw Superman, the hero we have been conditioned to expect to only ever do the right thing. This leads me to the bottom line. This movie is an interpretation. I love this movie, but if you didn't, that's totally cool. Like, no one's right, no one's wrong. It's just, how you feel about this movie. But if you didn't like this movie, then I, at the very least, would encourage you to consider the mission of the filmmakers, as well as the fact that film demands risk-taking. Being safe would have been even more damaging, and we wouldn't have gotten the beautiful and complex new world that will serve as the backdrop for the DC cinematic universe. And so far we've got an outstanding cast, talented craftsmen, inspiring writers, and a director who's very ambitious and who complements good writing with visuals that pack quite a punch. I can only hope that every character in the DC universe gets treated with as much care, admiration, and enthusiasm as the Man of Steel was for this movie. I really love and admire what Donner did for his movie, but we are in a new day and age of storytelling. We are being challenged. We are being asked to think and not just accept. And after 2 years of thinking, I accept. Man of Steel gets 5 out of 5 stars. To wrap this love letter up, I am seeing Dawn of Justice at the AMC Van Ness 14 IMAX in San Francisco. And after seeing it, I am going to allow the process to do its magic and inspire me. We'll see how it all turns out. Thank you very much for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. I wish you a very inspiring day.